Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another ASPI webinar, and this one I think it will be particularly fascinating, not just for intelligence aficionados, but also for people interested in Australian political and organisational history. So I'm Michael Shoebridge. I'm ASPI's Director of Defence Strategy and National Security, but really I'm the minor act here today. We have two incredibly experienced, insightful people that I think will have a fantastic conversation. And the first one is Margaret Stone, Justice Margaret Stone, former Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, and before that, a federal court justice, before that, long-term university law lecturer, and even worked for Freehills, as I understand it. So a huge career behind her and some real insights relevant to the work of intelligence from her last role. And then Peter Edwards, an eminent author and historian and author of biographies of influential Australians. My two favourites, the one around Sir Arthur Tang, and then the one that we're here to talk about today, his recent biography of Justice Robert Marsden Hope. So welcome to the two of you. What we're going to do with this conversation is Margaret and then Peter will make some brief opening remarks, and then it will be a conversation between us. And for people participating as the audience, there's that chat function. So if you've got a question that you would like to ask at any time, just put it in that chat function, and I'll draw them out during the discussion. So with that, Margaret, delighted to see you and wonderful that we can connect virtually. Would have been even better to have this as an in-person discussion here at ASPI, but this is the next best thing. I'm delighted you've got ASPI colours on your pictures behind you there. So that was...
deliberately so, Michael.
That was a lovely gesture. But Margaret, can you just maybe give us your reaction to the book and hope the man that comes out of it?
Well, I think the thing you need to know about this book is that Peter Edwards has a story to tell. It's about a man. It's about a family man. It's a man of varied and cultural interests. He's quick to laugh. He's quick to anger. He's quick to judge and stubborn to withdraw. He's a man of gravitas and natural dignity, but without any pretension or arrogance. He's a man of great intellect, practical rather than ideological, but overwhelmingly a man of integrity and principle. And he was, of course, Robert Marsden Hope. I hope that gives you a feeling of what this book is about, because it's a tale told with meticulous research and precision, there's enough drama in the book, there's no unnecessary dramatising. And my recommendation is have a quick read of the area that most interests you, and then go back to the beginning to look at his background and upbringing, and suddenly you will start to see how he became the man he was. And that's what I mean about it being meticulous. And it was Australia's good fortune that Hope largely deployed his talents in the public sphere. While he would have been disappointed that his widely anticipated appointment to the High Court did not come through, his appointment to successive royal commissions, and especially into the intelligence community, led him to make a lasting contribution to the governance of Australia, well beyond what he might have made as a justice on the High Court. He was a righteous man, and he had strong values and underlying principles, absolute integrity. He was not particularly interested in the underlying principles. And my view is that he is unlikely to have made on the High Court the same impact or anything like the impact that he subsequently made through the work he did, in particular, from my point of view, in the intelligence community. So Hope laid the structure and the backbone of not only the intelligence community as we know it now, but his recommendation was for the Office of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security to be established. And he emphasised the need for integrity and particularly independence that has been so essential in the Inspector General gathering force as a small agency will, starting with 1 or 2 people and going up to its present numbers, which are sort of round about the 40 level, I think. Obviously, as the task of the intelligence agencies has become more complex, so has the Office of the Inspector General. So I might just leave it there and wait for questions and hand over to Peter.
Great, thank you, Margaret. And I know you won't say it about yourself, but I think you have a forensic mind yourself. So for you to see some similarities in the strength of his judgment, I think is a great observation. Now, Peter, can you just take us through, well, your approach to the book, the big things that came out of it, and then I'm going to ask the first question after that, and it's actually not going to be about intelligence and security. It's going to be about a Governor General. But over to you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, ASPI, for hosting this, and particularly you, Michael. Thank you very much, Margaret, for the honour you've done me in contributing, in participating in this. I deeply appreciate it. An author at this stage usually makes a long list of thank you, but that would probably not be appropriate in these circumstances. I hope all those people will forgive me if I don't. But the acknowledgements in this book are very genuinely meant. I came to this topic more or less by accident because when the Robert Marsden Hope Building was named nearly 10 years ago, I think, the then head of ONA, Alan Ginchell, commissioned me to write a short monograph about hope and public policy. And I became so fascinated by the man and his work that I decided to turn it into a full-length biography.
I think Alan is participating in the webinar too, Peter. I thought I saw his name.
Yes, I regard him and Deborah Hope and Dennis Pierce as the 3 godparents of this this particular child, so to speak. And there are many others I could thank, but I've had a fascination always with the people who contribute to public policy but are not actually elected politicians, and particularly those who contribute to structures and policies which have an enduring effect well beyond their own period in office or indeed lifetimes. And that's why I was fascinated to work on Arthur Tang and now on Robert Hope. So that, I think, is enduring, and I think what I hope to do is, and pardon the puns, the unintentional or otherwise, what I hope to do as a biographer is to show how the personal qualities of an individual, the ones that Margaret has so eloquently described, affect not just how this individual went about his work, but also the enduring effect of those qualities on structures and policies that outlast them by a considerable way. And that's what I have tried to do in this book, and I'm very gratified by Margaret's comments. But I won't talk further about that. I'll be very interested to tackle whatever questions and comments people may want to make.
Great. Well, thank you, Peter. Well, so I mentioned a Governor General. You've talked about your interest in influential, powerful figures that haven't been in elected office. Well, I think there's a fascinating story about Justice Hope and Sir John Kerr. And it starts with them having discussions when Kerr first said he was interested in becoming Governor General. Peter, can you tell us a bit about those discussions before Kerr even became Governor General? Because I think it's really insightful for what happens next.
Yeah, well, the context is that Sir John Kerr was quite an effective Chief Justice of New South Wales, particularly as an administrator of the court. And he worked hard to reform the court, and he set up a committee system. But he also had what I think amounted to a kitchen cabinet, which was himself, the president of the Court of Appeal, Kenneth Jacobs, and Hope. And they used to, I gather, have a drinking session around about 5 o'clock each afternoon, to the annoyance of their respective wives. But keeping up with Kerr's drinking habits was quite an achievement in itself. But Hope recalls that Kerr constantly had many interesting conversations, but Kerr was not interested in the law as such. He was interested in power. He was fascinated by the way people held and exercised power in whatever domain it might be. And then when the offer of Governor General was made to him, Hope was one of the people with whom he discussed this offer. And Hope's immediate reaction was, "Oh no, you don't want to do that. That's just dressing up as a Boy Scout or opening fetes and garden parties and so on. You want to?" And Kerr immediately said, "No. Look at these clauses in the Constitution. Look at the business of money, the power of the Senate over money bills." And at another time, it's not clear whether it was just before, it was after the appointment was announced, but it's not clear whether Kerr had taken it up. They had a similar conversation, and Kerr pointed to the business about the Senate's power over money bills, and he said, "I'm going to have to deal with that." And if you now look at the Palace letters, you can see that Kerr was right from the start, as it were, undermining Whitlam's credibility and looking for a situation in which he could exercise the reserve powers long before they became a public
Yes.
public issue.
So what fascinates me about that is the way Kerr was thinking about the role even before he got it as a powerful one, and he was very keen to exercise the power. But then the next bit is equally interesting, which is when Hope hears what Kerr has done in dismissing Whitlam. Can you tell us that? You know, he was overseas at the time, and what was his reaction?
He was in, of all places, Stockholm. He was on a research trip to do with the First Royal Commission. And Stockholm, of course, the ambassador at the time was Lance Barnard, who'd only recently stepped down as Whitlam's deputy prime minister. And like everybody else, Barnard had no idea of what was happening. But everyone was totally shocked. The Swedes apparently thought that there'd been some sort of military coup in Canberra. But what is often forgotten is about all the documents is the document that Kerr put out at the time to explain why he'd taken this action. And I think it repays looking at now, because it was worded more or less like a legal judgment. And I think that's the way Kerr expected it to be taken. Hope and his chief assistant, George Brownbill, couldn't get a copy of that document at first, or the first one they could get was in French. And Brownbill knew French, which Hope didn't, and he read it out. And Hope kept shaking his head and said, "Oh, no. John Kerr wouldn't say that. Oh, no, that's all wrong." Now, unfortunately, we don't know precisely which bits he was reacting to, but he obviously was totally unimpressed by that. Then when he finally got a copy of it in English, He was totally unconvinced. Now, that was in, of course, November 75. By that stage, the first reports of the first Royal Commission were due to be completed. According to Brownbill, and a report of the Royal Commission was supposed to be handed to the Governor-General. It seemed that Hope delayed the confrontation with Kerr as long as he could, but finally had to present it to him. Kerr said to him, "Well, do you think I did the right thing?" Which is what he said to a lot of people at this stage. And Hope said, "No." And that they had a few drinks, as was their wont, but that was effectively the end of the relationship. They did not see each other on any basis after that.
Michael, may I just come in there with a question?
Margaret, please do.
Peter. Peter, given what you learned about Hope that you've just explained, do you think, how would you rate the importance of the Governor-General not having his or her own support base? I know it's a matter that's debated much in the community, and I wondered if you have any insights on that.
Sorry, what do you mean by
support? If the Governor-General was elected, for instance, by the people, would that give a support base? And would that raise any concern in a situation just described, or not? I don't know.
Well, my personal view, and as far as I can, I think consistent with Hope's views. Obviously, I don't know how he might have voted in the referendum in 1999, which was the year of his illness and death. But my own view is that we would not, an elected Governor-General would be a disaster, because it would mean we would have an elected Governor-General and an elected Prime Minister, and almost inevitably, sooner or later, there would be a clash between them, and a Governor-General having the to claim that he or she had independent support could actually prolong a crisis rather than otherwise.
Well, yes, and it strikes me that you'd have even more people interested in the office who were interested in the power of the office, and having a disinterested user of the powers seems to me to be a far preferable thing. Now, obviously, the book has a lot about Justice Hope's defining work around the intelligence community. And really, someone who did 3 royal commissions around the intelligence community had served 3 separate prime ministers, Gough Whitlam, Malcolm Fraser, Bob Hawke. It's quite a remarkable thing that those 3 very different prime ministers would choose that single figure to do that set of work through the royal commissions. And he's really set up some enduring institutional architecture, which lasted pretty much unchanged until just recent years. That separation of policy, assessment and collection, the separation of foreign and domestic collection responsibilities, and ASIO's role as the single agency that does combined collection and assessment around security intelligence, and then the office of the IDGIS as well. I wonder, looking back on that defining work, how well do you think it is enduring given the expansion of the intelligence community now? And I suppose I'll go first to you, Peter, and then Margaret to you from your perspective of your last role.
So, sorry, your question was how
well is the institutional, the conceptual and institutional framework, particularly the clarity around separation between policy and politics and intelligence assessment, and then assessment and collection, and the domestic and foreign divide that he established. How well do you think that has, do you think that's put Australia in a great position, and do you think it's still effective with the expansion of the intelligence community?
Well, I divide it into 2 periods, really. I think what you saw from over a 40-year period, from 1977, which was when the major reports of the first Royal Commission came out, up to 2017, I think what you saw was a steady, sometimes rather slow, implementation of Hope's recommendations. I mean, it took a long time, for example, for all the agencies to move to Canberra. 3 of them, when he set out, were in Melbourne. He said, well, they must be brought to Canberra. That took quite a while. It took and it wasn't until 2017 or 18, I think, that ASD was finally set up as a statutory authority, not only with the new name and clearly having a whole of government rather than departmental brief. So those things took quite a while, but over those 40 years, governments of all persuasions generally moved in the direction that he had outlined, sometimes fast, sometimes quite slowly. But during that time, I think the trust, the public trust and confidence in the intelligence agencies, which everyone agrees is absolutely fundamental to how they operate, did steadily grow. So that the confidence, for example, that people had in ASIO during the 2000s, at the time of Islamist terrorism, etc., was vastly greater than could have been imagined if you go back to the way ASIO was thought of in the 1960s and early 70s, just on the eve of Hope's work. So that has been consistent. I think there's been a radical challenge in the last few years. I think it came out on the same day I think it was July 2017, when the government announced 2 things on the same day. First was the recommendations of the Independent Intelligence Review by Michael L'Estrange and Stephen Merchant, which was quite explicitly an updating of Hope. L'Estrange had worked with Hope on one of the Royal Commissions, and they paid much more than lip service to what he'd done. And they said, well, some changes are necessary, and they explained why. But on the same day, the Department of Home Affairs was created, and that, I think, deliberately challenged and overrode several of those basic principles. What I would argue now is that we need a really substantial inquiry of an independent, substantial, comprehensive inquiry, something like the scope of Hope's first Royal Commission at least, to look at the way things have operated over the last 3 years, to see whether the structures are right, to see which principles are still valid from the 1970s and 80s, and which ones are not. As we've been discussing, there's just been published an authorised history of GCHQ, which is the British Signals Intelligence Agency, and they are saying that in recent years, signals intelligence cannot operate in quite the same way as it used to, and the expectation that analysis and collection may be totally separate, maybe that's different these days.
So Peter, I think that's you've made some really interesting observations there. I think, Margaret, from your point of view, I'm thinking IGIS is set up to ensure public confidence in the intelligence agencies through the oversight role it has. That seems to have been part of Hope's design for IGIS. And from your point of view, that institutional architecture that he put in place, what's your lived experience of it?
Well, I obviously can only talk about it as at 5 years ending in the latter part of August this year. But I think the structure that Hope set up has lasted and has been built on. So the importance of agencies not having enforcement powers the importance from the IGES position of not having enforcement powers, only recommendation powers. So ultimately, in my time, we didn't ever have any recommendation that wasn't accepted. But had that been the case, it eventually finds its way through to the minister and so on. The absolute imperative of keeping policy and what we do, I'm going to say we, I can't get out of the habit, so just, it's we till the end of August, that'll do. And what we do is to insist robustly, rigorously on independence, even in minor ways that might not seem important, but actually are, and to insist with equal robustness that we do not comment on policy. That doesn't mean that we might, so that would allow us to point out issues that might have been overlooked. And for instance, to ask the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security to consider whether a particular implication has been thought of and so on, but never to say you should have it or you shouldn't. Just, you might want to consider this. And it's to direct the attention of legislators to an ambiguity or an outcome that, as far as we can see, hasn't been considered and might be relevant matter for them if it is. So that is a very important element. The other element, I think, that has become increasingly important is having a culture of compliance within the agencies. It always has been an issue, but an office of whether it's 3 or 40 or 60 or 100 cannot ensure that thousands in the intelligence community comply. It has to be a joint exercise. And we've seen in other areas that, for instance, in the banking area, we've seen what happens if there isn't a culture of compliance. So that's something we worked very hard on. And in saying that, I acknowledge, indeed applaud, the activities of my predecessors, particularly my immediate predecessor, Dr. Vivienne Thom, in her robust defence of the principles that I've explained. And that leaves open to the charge made by some that we are too close to the intelligence agencies. It's one of the difficulties of dealing with secure and secret matters is you can't defend yourself. But it's not good enough to say, oh, well, if you knew what I know.
Well, that's interesting because we've got a question about the role of the PJCIS, and I think this is linked to that idea of public confidence and transparency. And I've been really taken by the current head of ASIO's work to give transparency to the functions of 2 agencies now. When he was in ASD, with speaking about coming out of the shadows and meaning it, and giving some much greater insights than people have had before about that agency. And he seems to be continuing that at ASIO. Do you think this is, in a world where there's such a contrast between authoritarian regimes that are completely untransparent and opaque and democratic open systems of government, do you think there'll be continuing pressures for more transparency despite the constraints of secrecy?
I think not despite the constraints of secrecy, but a well-judged evaluation of what those constraints are or should be. Now, Mike Burgess, Director General of Security, head of ASIO, has done wonders in that area. But he has a fine judgment, which he's prepared to back, about what it won't do harm to release, in fact, what it will do good to release, and what could not be released. So it's not just let's tell people more and more. And there may well come a time when he feels, and I hope this doesn't happen, that he needs to dig his heels in and say, no, I can't give you that. But I have every confidence in Mike Burgess's ability to make that distinction. And I don't leave, for instance, Paul Simons, head of ASIS, has a similar, different personality, but a similar ability to make that judgment. But of course, ASIS, with its often reliance on human sources, has a much more difficult role to play. So you can't say, look what ASIO's doing, why isn't ASIO doing it? Why isn't ASIS doing it? Or why isn't ASD? Because they all have difficult areas they're dealing with.
Although I think...
one more point.
Yep.
I think the intelligence agencies are, without exception, bodies of professional, dedicated people who want to comply. And our job was to help them comply.
I wonder though, Peter, back to Hope, it's fantastic that the agencies have professional people, and Margaret's talked about the judgment and capacity of two of the current heads. But would Hope say, well, should it all come down to those individual personalities, or should there be more institutional machinery that really forces some of that transparency? What do you think he would say now about that issue and things like the role of the PJCIS?
Yeah, in general, I think he would strongly agree that what you need is that compliant culture that Margaret just described. And in fact, that's why in dealing with ASIO, for example, which when he was starting his work was the only publicly known intelligence agency and the one that was most in controversy. So yes, he said in that he gave great attention not just to the legislation and not just to oversight mechanisms and so forth, but of also saying that they must just learn to behave with, as he put it, agencies must act according to their charter, that is the legislation, and he recommended that ones that didn't have legislation should have it, and that took a while to happen, within the law, but also with what he called propriety. So there are just some things that you don't do, even if it's legal. And there were things that ASIO was doing, for example, which were actually legal, but just improper. It's like leaking material to sympathetic people in the press. So yes, the argument about culture is very important. And you need that constant interaction with oversight agencies. The question about the parliamentary committee is an interesting one, because Hope was asked to look into this. And remember, when he started, he did most of his first research work in 1975, which American intelligence historians now refer to as the Year of Intelligence, because this was the year of the Church Committee and other congressional committees thoroughly investigating and producing damning reports on what the CIA in particular was doing. And Hope was very ambivalent. In fact, he said, look, on balance, I'm not sure that a parliamentary committee is a good idea. And what eventually happened, because it gives access to people who don't have the restraints of being ministers, etc. And there is the possibility of material being leaked. The Hawke was persuaded largely by Gareth Evans, I think, to have a parliamentary committee, but it only oversaw ASIO. And then that gradually grew until we now have the PJCIS, which is customarily referred to as one of the most powerful committees in Parliament. So I think it's a bit of a two-edged sword, but if the members of that committee understand that their role is bipartisan oversight, then that's a very good thing and an important thing, provided they don't succumb to the temptation of getting little bits of evidence and using it for their their particular policy preferences.
And so far, that clarity around it looks at administration and budgets, not operational work, that seems to have really helped make that committee keep a focus on what it can usefully do, including around legislative review. I wonder. Yes, Margaret, please do. Yeah.
I've often appeared before the PJCIS, and I have found them uniformly professional, as far as I could see, bipartisan, and very protective, very understanding of our need for independence. And that has helped us, where I thought something had the potential to interfere with our independence and went in quite strong on that. Lovely to be able to comment on a policy.
But is that our independence, our as in Aegis?
Sorry, the Aegis.
Yes. Yeah.
But the independence of the Inspector General and that agency, that in fact, it was nice to be able to comment on a policy, and I would do so only where it directly affected our core values. We had great success in preserving that independence. So I was very impressed with the PJCIS. But in relation to, now I'm freed of the constraints, in relation to giving the members of Parliament access to secret documents, can I say, and there may be ways to do it, but I have seen, and others on my staff commented, seeing parliamentarians being less than respectful of the secrecy of documents, including reading top secret documents in an aeroplane where it could be read by the passenger behind. So one has to be very careful.
Maybe in the new socially distant aircraft that will operate, that could be much better, Margaret. No, but that is a serious point. So the current arrangements deal with that pretty well. I wondered also, thinking about Hope and some of the arm wrestles he had with powerful figures, thinking about what if that were to happen now. So, Peter, I'm thinking particularly about Sir Arthur Tang and Justice Hope around where should the agency known as the Defence Signals Directorate, now the Australian Signals Directorate, be? And Hope, one of his defining insights was that intelligence agencies serve not just the portfolio they're in, they have a broader national purpose. But that wasn't something that Arthur Tang and he agreed on terribly well, was it?
No, in fact, one of the most prominent statements that Hope made in his first Royal Commission, he put right up front with heavy emphasis that one of his fundamental aims was to ensure that intelligence agencies were responsible to what he said, government as a whole, and this is long before whole of government became a sort of bureaucratic mantra. And the departments he was aiming at were primarily defence and to a lesser extent foreign affairs, because they between them controlled all but one of the agencies at the time. Tang, you're quite right, had a very different view. And there's something of an irony because Tang was engaged in a similar sort of exercise that was almost parallel to what Hope was doing. These were two occasions when Whitlam did not crash through or crash and come down with instant decisions, but handed two important reform tasks to people outside the government to work out an enduring scheme. And most of Tang's reforms in defence have lasted well, just as Hope's in intelligence did. But having said that, where they disagreed was particularly on what is now called DIO, Defence Intelligence Organisation. And yes, Tang had a very much a traditional departmental view of how government should be run. So they did clash, and one of the highlights of my research was discovering the actual text of a special meeting where held for Tang to comment on Hope's recommendations concerning the future of defence intelligence. So that was a quite different policy, and I think that is what some people are concerned about today, because the question is whether the creation of Home Affairs has put one department in an unduly influential position, rather than having intelligence and policy making coordinated at the highest levels.
Well, that's the interesting thing to me, Peter. When I look at the Tang-Hope arm wrestle around both DIO and then DSD, the obvious current counterpart to that arm wrestle would be Home Affairs, Mr. Pezzullo, and if there was a Justice Hope around now, I wonder how Justice Hope would approach that particular arm wrestle.
I think he would want to. I think he'd be very worried about it, the coordination. Where there is too much influence. And this comes down to that fundamental question that I've already alluded to. Is it possible, are there strategic circumstances today that require a different level of coordination? But there's a wonderful paragraph in that independent intelligence review that I referred to by Lestrange and Merchant, where they say that intelligence assessments have to be of the subject and the time that policymakers want. But on the other hand, if intelligence assessments are seen to be influenced by what they call the preordained policy preferences and priorities of a particular area of government, then they will not be useful.
Which is exactly the independence that Margaret was talking about earlier, and the need to keep reasserting that. Another parallel between Hope's arrangements and now, I think, is in the pandemic. I wonder if the two of you see any parallels there. This whole prominence of expert medical advice and the fact it's listened to by political and policy decision makers, but it's given standing as expert advice that should be listened to and needs to be formed by those experts, in that case, medical experts. To me, that's got a bit of a hallmark of that same conceptual approach that Hope took to intelligence agencies and their interaction with policy and politics. Do you see any parallels with that? To me, I've been quite cheered up by the way that whole medical advice role has operated.
Yes, I think there is a certain parallel. It's an interesting comment, an interesting combination or comment today. But it's also an understanding that policymakers have to respect expertise, but also take it into consideration, and that understands the experts also have to understand that there are political considerations which may sometimes mean that their expertise it may be overruled, or their recommendations may be overruled. I think, wasn't it Churchill who said that experts should be on tap but not on top? So there's an ambivalence there, and the experts have to understand also that the person at the top has to take into consideration and give due respect to what they're saying, but also that they have all sorts of other pressures on them, which require careful handling. So yeah, but that's equally true of medical expertise today as it was of intelligence expertise in the past.
Any reflections from you, Margaret, on that?
Well, I think the other factor, I agree with everything Peter has said, but the other factor is that medical expertise abounds in the security, and while the people giving the advice are probably, I'm sure they are, at the top of their field, there are plenty of people who are capable of examining the material that led to their conclusions and pointing out if it was. Can you hear me?
We can now. You've frozen, but we can hear you. And now we can't hear you. No, we just we blanked out just after you said, "Can you hear me?" We'll come back to Margaret. So, Peter, what's the explanation for Justice Hope being chosen by three very different prime ministers? And normally that wouldn't happen. So, what do you think was so appealing to Gough Whitlam, Malcolm Fraser? Couldn't get any deeper political adversaries, and then Bob Hawke.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation, and I think I pay tribute to all three actually of Hope, Whitlam, and Fraser, because as you say, at this time, at the dismissal, a height of partisan tensions, both Whitlam and Fraser, as Prime Minister and leader of the opposition, and then reversing that position, understood how necessary it was to get the intelligence agencies beyond partisan politics. And the ASIO had been blatantly partisan up to that point, and that was something which clearly had to change. Whitlam and people working with him understood, including Lionel Murphy, with whom Whitlam did not always agree, to put it mildly. They understood that there was no point in just abolishing ASIO. You had to have some sort of institution like that, even though there was very strong pressure, and the last federal conference before the Whitlam government was elected came within one vote of adopting abolition of ASIO as official ALP policy. But they understood that wasn't going to work. ASIO had to be reformed, and very substantially reformed, and given oversight mechanisms, etc., but not abolished. And Fraser, for his part, understood that that the agency that ASIO couldn't operate in the blatantly partisan manner that it had in the past. So one of the things was that Hope kept in touch with the leader of the opposition, as well as the Prime Minister, in formulating and outlining the directions he was going. And he did that before the 75 election, and that served him well afterwards. He also laid great emphasis in his report on how the leader of the opposition of the day must always be kept in touch with what the agencies are doing, that they should regard their role as national, and that he recommended a number of measures to ensure that they were genuinely national institutions. And
which, if you think right now, Peter, think about the need for absolute bipartisan solidarity around pressing issues like policy around China. that framework that Hope put in place, where the opposition are briefed and given those insights, seems to me to be something that we're really benefiting from now, with the enormous pressure that the government and the parliament are under. So that is a fascinating kind of insight from you there. One thing Margaret talked about, the character that Justice Hope had, about him being both very quick with a judgment, slow to withdraw a judgment, but also quite humble and with a real sense of civil liberties. Again, I think that civil liberties stream is really valuable now. You think about the ASIO Act and the fact that it's defined by having a clear purpose not to do anything to interfere with lawful protest and dissent and civil liberties. Now, to keep public confidence in these agencies as they have obviously more powerful roles, that seems to be another defining contribution, where Hope wove in that sense of civil liberties, whether it was the security agencies not having enforcement powers, or whether for an agency like ASIO being very mindful of making sure that lawful dissent and protest were absolutely protected and not subject to ASIO's powers. What are your thoughts about that and the current environment?
Yeah, he was very strong on that. An absolutely fundamental principle was that ASIO must not become a sort of political police force. And the abolitionists called their campaign the campaign against political police. He was very strong on that. He was also very strong on the separation of ASIO and the defining of their relationships with the various police forces, both at the federal and state levels. And the third inquiry, or the one that came in between the two royal commissions, was known as the Protective Security Review, and that followed the Hilton Hotel bombing. And it was very largely about precisely that, the relationship that ASIO should have with police forces. At the time, it had a very bad relationship with the Commonwealth Police, the forerunner of the AFP, but rather unhealthily close relations with the special branches of the state police forces. And it was Hope who really initiated the process by which the successive state governments began to abolish the special branch of their respective police forces, which he thought were doing rather more harm than good. So that was a fundamental principle, and that is why I think there are people who are, shall we say, raising eyebrows at the current arrangement, where you have ASIO taken out of the Attorney General's Department and put into Home Affairs alongside the Federal Police and Border Force, which is a law enforcement agency of its own, as well as certain other intelligence agencies. So you've got law enforcement and security intelligence in what some people would regard as an unhealthily close relationship. Now, they have their separate legislation, they have separate oversight mechanisms, but even so, there's that question of culture to which Margaret quite rightly referred, is so important there. And if there's a sort of departmental culture that operates across those agencies, that is not what, that is counter to precisely what Hope was seeking to establish.
Michael, can you hear me now?
Yes, we've just been talking about Justice Hope's civil liberties thoughts and the way he wove that into his work, including being very clear. You made the point about the intelligence agencies not having enforcement roles, but also in being very clear that nothing should get in the way of lawful protest and dissent.
Yes.
So we've been talking about that. We're running out of time, but there's been another question about the changing role of ASD. And the question talks about ASD maybe getting enforcement powers. I'm not sure that that is true from what
I
I
don't think
see.
that's the right way to characterise it.
No, but there is a shift in ASD's role around cyberspace and cybercrime that really does give it a domestic function. And one of Hope's principles was to separate the foreign intelligence agencies, the collectors, foreign from the domestic functions. Peter, what's your thought about how important a blurring that is? Because there would be a really strong counter-argument that, well, international and domestic issues have kind of collapsed anyway, driven as much from technology as well as the way states can now use power and technology to reach right into domestic boundaries. So do you think he would have a problem with that change in ASD's role?
I think that's one of the areas that certainly does need to be argued or needs to be thought about very carefully. I mentioned this new history of GCHQ, and that makes the point that all sorts of the traditional boundaries have been blurred today. And I think a lot of people would understand that the division between foreign and domestic isn't the same as it used to be. And GCHQ also points out that communications between, well, in our case, say Melbourne and Sydney, may actually pass through Beijing or Moscow or wherever. You know, the internet has changed everything. And as well, having, you know, terrorists operating within Australia, the so-called homegrown terrorists and so on, all those things make the situation totally different. So it is appropriate to work out how ASD should operate in a whole of government, with whole of government responsibilities. But at the same time, that it must be ensured that they are operating in accordance with whole of government priorities, so that their intelligence operations should be coordinated and directed by the Office of National Intelligence, which is the coordinating function.
It sounds like there might be some police hounds there.
Can I come in there?
Yes, please do.
Our next door neighbours have Siberian Huskies, and I think they're looking to the Arctic.
I'm conscious we're running out of time.
Yep.
I think Justice Hope showed an amazing ability to adjust himself to the exigencies of the time. And so the distinction that needs to be made is, and this is why I don't think enforcement's a good word, when I close my gate and don't let you in, am I enforcing? If I allow you to drive your car to my gate, because that's a public road, but don't let you in, is that enforcement? If I go out and let you down your tyres so you can't drive anywhere, is that enforcement? So I think Peter's right. Things have changed so much that the times need different methods. And whether or not Robert Hope would have had anything in mind for that, I think his model of adjusting to the exigencies of the time is one that can be followed, and we need to ask ourselves both about the question that's of enforcement, but also of propriety. And his insistence on not just legality, but also propriety, which found its way into the Act which governs the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, is one of the most powerful aspects of the work the Inspector General does in making sure that the agencies not only observe the legalities, but also propriety, act properly. And that emphasis on propriety helps you establish a culture of compliance.
Yes. Well, look, thank you both so much. It turned out to be a very short hour, so I'm sorry that we didn't have more time. And Margaret, thank you for reconnecting there, but
Oh,
that's
it's
a
really
wonderful.
hard. I'm sorry, but I don't
That's
know.
right. A wonderful note to end it on, because I think those ideas of transparency, public confidence, oversight, and propriety are still very central to how all the agencies have to work. And that does indeed set Australia up well in the times that we're living in. So thanks again to the two of you, and I'm sure this won't be the last time that we speak. And thank you to all of you who are participating and asking questions. I've taken them up, and I look forward to having you at other events. Thanks so much.